This is Matt Snape from TAFE, New South Wales. Today we're going to be looking at creating polar arrays in the AutoCAD 2020 software. In a previous video we've looked at rectangular arrays. Polar arrays are very similar but require some extra detail as they have some additional options available. So an example of a polar array is like you see here on the screen next to me. So to create this using other commands, you'd need to use rotate and rotate copy. It would be fairly time consuming and painful. One of the great things too about the polar array command is that you can go back later and edit some of the basic settings in the polar array if a pattern needs to be modified at a later date. So firstly, if we have a look at this design here, we can see that our pattern has some basic information with it. So firstly, we need to locate the center of our polar array. That's very important, and we will need something there when we actually do our polar array to act as a snap point. So we do definitely need to have some sort of construction in place to give us that center point. We'll also need to make sure that we've got our objects to actually be copied as part of the array pattern. So in this situation here, that would most likely be our center line and the circle. So a center point on the 60 and 75mm dimensions, and also our objects. This centerline circle that passes through the center of each of these holes is known as the PCD or pitch circle diameter. It's a circle that shares the center point with the array pattern and also passes through the center point of each of these holes. Pitch circle diameter, or PCD, is a very common abbreviation that's used to describe or explain patterns of this type, so it's certainly a piece of terminology that you should become accustomed to. We'll also see here that we have 8 holes in this pattern, and the other thing too is that we'll notice that we don't have one of the holes starting in an obvious location. That's really important. So in this situation here, all I'm going to do is I'm going to put an angular dimension between our center line and center line. That gives us 15 degrees, so that's going to allow us to set up our first object in a particular place. So once you know where that first object is, all we need to know is the center point of the array and also the number of objects in the array pattern itself. So let's have a closer look at doing that in practicality. So over here I've set up the construction we'd need. So I've come in 60 and come down 75 to give us our two center lines here. I've also already drawn the 80 PCD or pitch circle diameter line, and I've also already drawn the 15 degree or inclined it from the vertical at 15 degree center line, and it's the intersect point between the circumference of our PCD and that center line that gives us the center point for that first circle. So I'll just go in and I'll draw that first circle. Of course, if we knew that one of our circles was on the intersection of the vertical center line or the horizontal center line and the circumference of the circle, we wouldn't need to worry about this additional construction that we've got with that 15 degree line. Okay, so once we've done that one, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to shorten down our center line, and the reason I'm doing that is that when I do this array, I'm going to copy both the circle and its center line at the same time. It's important to always make sure you array as many objects as you can with each process, because it'll save you a lot of time and work. So once we've selected the objects, we can go up and we can activate the polar array. Now if we just click on the little down arrow here, you'll see the polar array option. Obviously it's the last of these commands that you used. It will be the icon at the top. You don't have to click the down arrow, you can just click on it if it's there. Now, having already selected the objects, you'll see that the first thing it's asking me for here to specify the center point of the array. This is why it's so important to ensure that you've got construction in place before you start the process, so you can simply snap on that center point. And it needs to be accurate. very common mistake is to not quite get the center point right, and although the array may look correct, that it won't be. So as soon as we specify that center point, it's taken the selected objects and it's arrayed it around that point, and the default is 6 copies. Now if we go up here to our polar array creation or array creation ribbon that's now appeared, you can see that we can come out here and we can change the number of objects. So we want 8 in this particular circumstance. So we've updated that. Because we know our first one is in the right location, and because we know the number of the objects in this 360-degree array, then we can be confident that all of these are in the correct position. Now the other thing that you can do in polar arrays is you can set up rows. Rows are concentric rings of the same object copied. So for example, in this situation, if I were to put in 2, you can see that we get a second ring of 8 objects around the outside of the first. It's not something that I've commonly had to use, but certainly it's an option there if you need it. You'll also notice that there is a spacing between our rows, and of course that distance, which is by the way calculated based on the PCD and the size of the objects that's selected, but that distance represents center point to center point, or same point to same point of each of these objects. Change that back to 1, and as soon as I move the cursor onto the screen, it updates the array that's displayed. Now, so one of the other things that we can do here as well is we can select to either rotate options or rotate items or not rotate items. So generally speaking, they'll be rotated. Now, if it's a circle and only a circle that you're creating a polar array from, it doesn't really matter whether they're rotated or not, because it'll still appear exactly the same. If, however, like in this situation, you've got a line, like a center line involved, or if it's an object that's rectangular or square or a different shape, then by not rotating the items, you'll see that what happens is that we end up with all the center lines running in the same direction in this situation. So for this and for most occurrences, then we'd be wanting to rotate the items. Now we can also change our number of items and our fill. So for example, we can decide to fill 180 degrees of this instead. And you can see now that's fitting 8 objects into 180 degrees, but we might decide, oh, we only actually want 4. Okay, so you've got options like that as well. You can essentially use these different choices, these different fields up here in the array creation ribbon, like a little calculator, if you like. So you can put in the numbers that you know, and it'll tell you the other numbers. But I'll just keep that as a standard 8 objects over 360 degrees. And you can see here that actually tells us that that means that they're going to be separated by 45 degrees. Okay, now just like with rectangular arrays, we can make this array associative or not associative. Associative means it will stay as an array object. So if you want to come back and make changes to any of these settings, you'll be able to. If you unclick Associative Array, you will never have that opportunity. It essentially explodes the array back into its individual components as soon as you finish creating it. If we leave it at Associative, you can make sure that the array is correct, make any changes that you need to, and then if you want separate objects later on, simply select the entire array, go to the Home tab, Modify panel, and select the Explode option. So that's the basics of creating a polar array. Once we've done that, you'll see that we've got an associative array, and if we select on it again, we can go back and make changes. So it's used in much the same as the rectangular array. Just remember the information that's needed for it. Must know where the center point is, must have some geometry there to give you something to snap to. Alright, must have the object, the first object, in the correct position to give you the polar array is orientated correctly. Alright, and don't forget to make sure that you draw the first object or objects so that you're copying as many as you possibly can in the one array process in order to minimize your work. So that's just a quick little bit of information on polar arrays. Make sure you review this video as often as you need. and complete any exercises that you've been provided in order to practice these new skills. The polar array is a very useful command in AutoCAD. It's commonly used in a lot of different areas, so it's certainly a very good tool to have in the toolbox.